now. Great, I see a lot of people streaming in. We're going to start the webinar very shortly. Thank you everyone for joining this webinar. It's just a bit before 11 and we'll kick it off in a minute or so and give everyone a moment, a few seconds to connect. Tiffany writes, good morning. Hi, Tiffany, how are you? I see a lot of familiar names there in our attendance list. So it's great to see so many names there. It's just hit 11 a.m. We're just going to give it a few more seconds to let everyone connect because I still see many people streaming in. So we'll give it a few more seconds and then we'll kick off today's webinar. Okay, great. So it looks like we have a great turnout today with over 170 individuals in attendance and with still some more streaming in. So I want to thank everyone for showing up. We know that PMs are super busy. So if we're taking time away from your day, we want to make sure that your time is being well spent. So I believe today's webinar is going to be a super helpful one. As everyone here knows, EV charging has become a very hot topic in Condoland. Adoption of EV cars has gone from being a more of an if it happens type of situation to more of a when it happens situation. And condos are really scrambling to plan for the forecasted spike in demand for EVs. So while we at Condonexus don't provide EV charging solutions, we provide electronic proxy voting and hosted virtual AGM solutions for condos. This means we've hosted thousands of virtual AGMs. And I only mention that because that's what's given us a perspective on EV charging trends at condos. So over time, we've seen questions about EV charging go from being asked from time to time back in 2020 to now being asked quite regularly at our meetings. So that's why we want to set up this webinar to help property managers be prepared for the transition to EV and to help them intelligently answer questions from condo owners and residents. That's why we've set up this webinar. So with that, I'm going to turn the meeting over to Brad Chaplick. He's a partner from Levitt, Lella, Duggan, and Chaplick LLP, and he'll be chairing today's webinar.
All right, thank you so much, Anthony. So it's my pleasure to be here, and I'd like to start by introducing the panel. So we have Anthony, of course, from Condonexus, Michaela Popescu from Dell Property Management, myself, and Manny Alter from EVdirect. And the first thing we're going to jump into is a brief overview of the regulatory framework. So Anthony, do you have the slide there? Okay, great. So what does the legislation for EV charging in Ontario condominiums look like? Well, let's start by considering what it used to look like. So before May 1st, 2018, we were relying on sections 97 and 98 of the Condominium Act. Section 97 talks about changes to the common elements by a condominium corporation, and Section 98 talks about changes to the common elements made by a unit owner. And what would happen is a unit owner who was thinking of purchasing an electric vehicle would go to the condominium corporation under the old Section 98 framework, and they would ask for permission to install a charging station in their parking space. And the condominium corporation had no rules or obligation about how to respond to that request. And many condominium corporations said that they did not want to consider it yet, or now isn't the right time because it posed difficult technical problems for condominiums. And so owners would not have their request easily approved, and this discouraged people from adopting electric vehicles when living in condominium buildings. And so this was seen as a barrier to adoption. And the end result is the law changes. Section 97, which deals with the approval process for condominium corporations to upgrade infrastructure, becomes easier for the condo. And Section 98 gets replaced with a new approval process, which is mandatory and makes things much easier for unit owners to get approval and install electric vehicle charging systems. So starting with the Section 97 change and the new regime that we have in its place, you will see under the old Section 97 requirement, for those who are familiar, if you are under 1% of your common element budget, there is no notice required. If you're between 1 and 10% of your budget, you're giving a 30-day notice to owners, similar to a notice of rule. And if you're over 10%, then it's called a substantial change, and you're having a 2/3 majority vote. So what this gets replaced with is now if you're between the 1 or 10%, or if you're actually under the 10% threshold, instead of 30 days and the possibility of a simple majority vote, it's a 60-day notice to owners, but there is no opportunity for owners to vote. And then if you're over 10% in terms of the cost of the infrastructure upgrade as a percentage of your overall budget, instead of a substantial change vote, if you're over 10% now, it's the 60-day notice to owner and then the possibility of a requisition for a simple majority vote. So what it was like before, if you were between the 1 and 10%, is now for the over 10% approval process. So this makes it much easier. It removes the obligation of a substantial change vote, and it allows condominium corporations to do infrastructure upgrades in circumstances where that is necessary to facilitate electric vehicle charging for unit owners. And some of our later presenters will get into circumstances of how that works. So that's the Section 97 condominium corporation side of things. How does it work for unit owners who want to install in their own parking space? So now we have, instead of the old Section 98 agreement, board having full discretion process, we have a new process. And I'll take you through it step by step. Step 1, the unit owner is going to submit a written application, and that application has to be complete. It has to include certain details, plans, specifications about the manner of the installation. And upon receipt of that owner application, step 2 is to check it for completeness. Does it have all of the necessary documents attached to it? And the condominium corporation has to check it as soon as reasonably possible, according to the legislation. What does as soon as reasonably possible mean? Because this phrase comes up a couple times throughout the regulations. Well, it doesn't mean instantly. And there is no good definition in the legislation. And so we interpret it as meaning within a week and preferably sooner. So you're going to get an application. You're going to check it for completeness as soon as reasonably possible. And once it is complete, we're going to move to step 3, which is on the next slide. And step 3 is assessing the application and then providing a response within 60 days of receipt of a complete application. So that let's look at what that response might be in step 4. And there's basically 3 responses you can give. You can approve the application without any changes. You can approve the application but require changes to it, or you can reject the application, and we'll get into the circumstances as to when you can require changes and when you can reject. But for now, let's look at what happens if you don't respond within 60 days. It's deemed to be approved without changes. And that has happened a number of times for condominium corporations that were not aware of the regulation. The owner submits an application. The application is complete because the owner has gotten advice on what to do. The condominium corporation has sat on the matter. They didn't know that they had a 60-day deadline to respond. The 60 days passes and the unit owner writes to them on day 61 and goes, well, looks like my application's approved. And all of a sudden they are caught and they didn't realize this was coming. So this is a big pitfall. And one of the things that I would want to warn every condominium manager about is to set that 60-day reminder as soon as you receive one of these applications. Okay. next step. Once the application is approved, and we'll talk about rejection and requiring changes in a moment, but assuming it's approved, the next step is to prepare a written agreement, also known as an installation agreement. This has to be done within 90 days. And if you can't reach an agreement on a installation agreement, then there's a dispute resolution process, but that's pretty rare. So what has to go into a valid installation agreement? Well, there's certain criteria, minimum items that have to be discussed in the agreement for it to be valid. You, of course, have to describe the installation and allocate the cost of who's paying to do it. Then you're going to set out who's responsible for use, operation, maintenance, repair, and insurance, and who's going to pay for those things. You're going to set out who's responsible for actually the cost of preparing the agreement itself and registering it on title, because it has to be registered. And you're also going to describe the termination of the use of the electric vehicle charging system and then the removal of the agreement from title when that happens. So those are the minimum criteria for a valid installation agreement. Once you have a valid agreement, you're going to register it on title as soon as reasonably possible, because the agreement is not effective until it is registered. And then you're going to be able to proceed with your installation in accordance with the terms and conditions of the agreement. What happens if a unit owner breaches? So just like in Section 98 agreements, if the unit owner breaches, you can add any cost resulting from a unit owner's breach to the common expenses attributable to that owner's unit. Okay. Under what circumstances can you reject an owner's application? If there's a contravention of the electrical safety code or any other relevant legislation, if it's going to have an impact on the structural integrity of your building or pose a serious risk to the health and safety of any person or damage to the property. And you have to present this in an expert report, and a copy of that report has to be provided to the unit owner. There are rare circumstances where you can redact the report. They almost never apply. So you're going to be going out, getting a report, and proving that these things are true. When can you require a change to an owner's application? So next slide, you can require a change to the owner's application if the charging system is going to materially interfere with other owners' use and enjoyment of the property, or to comply with your declaration, bylaws, or rules, or a shared facilities agreement if the parking garage is shared. And any change that you require cannot result in a quote unreasonable additional cost to the owner. So in circumstances where you want to prevent interference with others and you need to comply with your condo corporation's rules, bylaws, declaration, or shared facilities agreement, you can require that change so long as it does not result in an additional cost. And you have to explain how and why you reach that conclusion and provide the owner with an alternative installation plan that satisfies the condominium corporation's need for a change. So that's how the change process works. And very quickly, some takeaways. So we suggest that you have a policy and a simple standardized application form that owners can complete. A properly designed application form is going to ensure that necessary plans and specifications are attached and that the application is ready to be assessed. You can also have a pre-approved installation agreement. So a pre-approved installation agreement, a proactive EV installation policy, and an application form are going to satisfy a lot of criteria for you. Anthony, I'm on my last slide now. We want to make sure costs are allocated properly. We want to minimize administrative burden and make things easy for both the manager and the owner. We want to make sure that engineering costs are minimized and legal costs are minimized. And so by having a good policy, a nice application form, and a nice installation agreement on hand, ready to go, you can do all of those things. I'm 30 seconds over my time. Next up is Michaela.
Thank you very much, Brad. Thank you for the presentation. So hello, everybody, and thank you for joining into this webinar. Anthony, yes, if you could put my slides on. So I am going to talk about the manager's perspective. So the first slide is design a plan with the board. So you need to be aware of what is the board's vision, because EV charging stations could be installed in an owner parking space by individual owners upon getting approval from the board, which Bradley kindly explained. And that solution could be used as a short-term solution. And the corporation has to also find a way to monitor the electricity consumption and to charge back the owner for the electricity costs. They could be installed in the visitors parking area. That installation should be in addition to and not in place of owner installation in their personal parking space. Notice to owners is required. Declaration should be checked. Could be done as a project in several parking spaces approved by the board and implemented by the corporation. Next slide, please. Conduct a survey among residents and review the results to understand the current as well as near future as well as distant future interest. Anthony will talk more about that later on. Next slide, please. Engage an electrical engineering consultant to do a proper electrical capacity assessment, comparing the power capacity of the building versus the peak loads. Nobody wants to have breaker strip and potentially having vital building equipment offline. The engineer will visit the site, will install electrical device in the main electrical room, review the electrical infrastructure by carefully reviewing the electrical drawings, review and analyze the corporation's hydro bills, and calculate the total available spare power. Based on that electrical capacity assessment, the engineer will be able to calculate the total number of EV chargers that the building could safely accommodate. What if there is not enough power to accommodate EV chargers? You and your electrical engineer need to reach out to the electricity provider in your area, like Toronto Hydro, Electra, PowerStream, and you need to start the conversation regarding how much extra power is available in the area where the building is located, how much power is available on that particular street. It is very unlikely that Toronto Hydro will be able to provide you with extra power on the main existing building line. And it might be that they need to bring another line to the building to provide you with increased capacity. Generally speaking, we all know that the electricity is being distributed to the consumer on high voltage lines, because as the voltage is higher on the line, the loss of electricity is reduced. Therefore, you need another transformer to reduce the voltage and bringing to the user voltage. You need to have a powerful main switch disconnect installed on the new line and more disconnects down the line so that you are facing an expensive project. So you need to maximize the number of EV chargers that could be safely accommodated by controlling the power output distribution. Different EV chargers contractors have different approaches to achieve this by implementing slightly different solutions. It would be a good idea to ask the engineer if individual owners that have already installed the EV chargers in their own parking spaces could be integrated later on in the corporation's projects. What would be involved in that and the associated costs? Next slide, please. Based on the interest among owners and the results of the electrical capacity assessment, the board could consider the construction project. The engineer could be retained to design the system and obtain comparable proposals from EV charger installers. Your electrical engineer will involve electrical safety authority throughout the process. It is very important that all electrical work in the building is ESA approved to comply with the electrical code that calls for specific installation requirements to make it safe. For example, if you are installing electrical equipment in the garage, you need to install the panel in an area where it is not exposed to floods. The equipment has to be guarded and preferably in the well-ventilated area, and you need to have enough room around it to be able to maintain it. The property manager, the board, and the engineer should interview the EV contractors to be able to evaluate each option and to determine which solution is the best for the corporation. Buildings are very different. Layout is different. Location of the electrical room is different. So there is no one solution fits all. Next slide, please. Based on the estimated costs and based on the financial situation of the corporation, the board should determine how it will be financed. Is the infrastructure going to be financed by the corporation, with the individual charging stations being financed by each owner? Is the cost of the infrastructures going to be divided and charged back to each interested owner? A lot to consider. Once the board has determined how the project should be financed, communication to owners is very important to get participation. Owners that want to take advantage of the projects could be asked to register and pay a deposit. Next slide, please. Government rebates are time sensitive. It seems that they are set up for a certain period of time each year. Every condominium corporation should be timing this project to get the government rebates, and the electrical engineer and or the contractor should take care of that aspect on behalf of the condominium corporation. If the long-term strategy involves adding transformers, sub-panels, and any other electrical equipment to expand the system, the board might consider installing it as part of a larger project to try and benefit from the government rebates. Next slide, please. Legal advice should be obtained. In developing a board policy regarding the EV chargers installation, and to draft an application form that the owners could use, to draft and register all agreements to individual unit titles, as Brad has just kindly explained, to guide the board regarding the required notices to be sent to all owners, to provide a legal opinion on any proposed agreement between the corporation and the contractor installing the system, as well as between each owner and the contractor. Next slide, please. It is very important to establish who will be measuring and allocating the electricity consumption. The best practice is to have a third-party company doing that. Next slide, please. The board and the property manager should ask pertinent questions before the board making any decisions. Is the proposed equipment proprietary? Could the corporation change the monitoring billing company in the future? Is there an app that the owners could use to see their consumption and billing? How often is the corporation going to receive the electricity costs back? Is there an access control on the system that ensures that only eligible owners can charge? Is the system scalable so that more owners that choose to have an EV charger in their parking spot could be added on the same system in the future? Is the system compliant with open charge point protocol solutions so that the board is not locked to a system that cannot change down the road? The board and property manager should get the answers to all these questions and many other questions. Next slide, please. The main focus should be finding a turnkey solution. A solution without software may require alternate payment reconciliation that could be cumbersome. There are some companies on the market that are offering to install the infrastructure at no upfront cost for the corporation, and that could be a viable solution, especially for some corporations that might be facing some financial difficulties, and not only. This is usually a solution similar with having a rental hot water tank installed in your house. Some corporations and some owners might prefer the maintenance-free solution and having a third-party proprietary equipment installed on the premises. Legal counsel should be engaged before any approval of any work of that nature to thoroughly check on the proposed agreement between the corporation and any provider, as well as to check on the proposed agreement between such company and the unit owner. Please reach out to your district manager, regional manager to get support with a project of that nature, as there are many aspects to consider. Next slide, please. I cannot stress enough that clear communication with all parties involved, and especially informing unit owners at the beginning and during any project of that nature is one of the key elements to success. And I will now pass on the mic to Brad.
Thank you, Michaela. Okay, just keeping an eye here on the Q&A tab. This is for Anthony, actually. A common question so far is attendees wanting to know if they can see the presentation after the live stream and if they can get copies of the slides. Any impact on that before we jump into Manny's presentation? Anthony, you're muted.
Of course, I'm muted. Yeah, so to answer your question, yes, webinar is being recorded and we will circulate it to all attendees after the meeting. And we can also circulate all the presentation slides as well.
All right, thank you. Okay, let's go into Manny Alter at EVdirect.
Thanks, Brad, and good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. So Michaela did a great job explaining from a property manager point of view the EV charging. I want to talk about from a contractor point of view what we recommend to the buildings that we work with. So I want to preface by saying, number one, EV charging in condos is not complicated. There's a lot of information that you need to gather. There's a lot of information that you need to go through, but the general understanding of EV charging is quite simple. And that is power delivery. No different than needing a plug in your bathroom for an appliance, a hair dryer, or in your kitchen for, a new toaster. What we're doing is we have parking spots that don't have power or energy in them. We want to find a power source. We want to run pipe and wire, and we want to put an appliance or a charging station at the end of the line. The reason why things get complicated in condominiums in most buildings in North America is that every building and every condo has limitations. Now, there's three major limitations or three main limitations, and those limitations, if they are not dealt with on day one, can become a major issue for the building. The other recommendation we have before we jump into the limitations is we believe that every condo, regardless of if you think you have an immediate need or not, should be going down this road and gathering information, because the process does take 4 to 6 months, if not longer, to really go through this and understand what is best for your building. There isn't, one size fits all. Every building has its own needs, its own limitations, and therefore our recommendation is go through this process as if you're deciding tomorrow morning. If you get to the end of the line and there isn't a need, you can shelve the package till you actually need it. So what are the limitations that condos need to consider? The first limitation, and the major one, is power. So there is definitely not enough power on the grid. There's definitely not enough power in most buildings to accommodate the future need for electric vehicles. So prioritizing or giving owners as they come in EV charging is probably not the best idea. Now, the average EV driver, and I don't know if on this call there are people who drive EV, but we're pretty much topping off every night. So you come home, you plug in your vehicle, you're leaving with 400 or 500 kilometer range, you're driving your 30, 40, 50, 100 kilometers and coming home. So if the average EV driver is charging 1 to 3 hours per night and really not going to need more than 4 to 6 in the worst case scenario, if power is limited in the building, why are we giving 100% of power 100% of the time to one owner? Let's share that power. So, power management systems, as Michaela brought up, is something that is becoming popular and something that is extremely important to not run out of power. Now, we've looked at it, personally about 4,000 condos. If designed properly, we don't believe that the majority of condos will have to ask for more power. You may need to ask for more power. That's something that you'd have to speak to your utility, but that can become very expensive. So if you can design something with the limited power within your building, where you're sharing that power between the owners that need it, you will benefit in the long run. The second limitation or consideration really is tracking and billing. And this is one that sometimes doesn't get enough, talking time. And that is, yes, there are companies that can track and bill for you. Yes, you can track and bill that energy internally because we're coming off the condo's mains, but really understanding what that means for the building. So if the solution, does not have a billing platform and requires the property manager to do it, it may be inexpensive, but it's something that's going to be a major burden for the property management, and most condos don't want that to happen. On the flip side, there's a lot of sub-metering companies or software companies, but really understanding what those costs are important. So I've heard from owners who say, I use $15 on my condo's energy. Why am I getting a $25 delivery fee? And that may be the only option you have, but really understanding that option is important. And then the third limitation is the layout and design. And that is, early on, 2018, 2019, the projects that we were doing, there wasn't a lot of thought going into it because there wasn't a lot of demand. And as demand grows, what's happening is, everyone's trying to run pipe and wire to these electrical panels, and the ceiling can become a mess, or vehicles can be far away from panels. So really understanding, not just trying to take care of today's limitation or need, which may be 1 or 2 EVs, but really saying, if we're going down this road, how do we accommodate the masses? How is this going to look? How are we sharing our power? How are we billing our power? And how are we connecting everyone to the system? Next slide, please. So the process in order to do this is really simple. There are a lot of companies out there that offer this. 1 and 2 really go hand in hand. And the first thing before you look at grants or do surveys or engage with your owners is site assessment and load assessment. There is no, one size fits all. Every building is unique. Every building has its own needs and its own limitations. So a site assessment and a load assessment will do 2 things. It will identify, what are those limitations within your building? It'll identify some of the needs and criteria that you will need as a building. And your load assessment, which is really the important piece, is how much available power do I have? And how do I share that power? If you have a parking garage of 100 spaces and your load assessment is 5-car capacity, or your load assessment is 50-car capacity, the two moving forward will look very different. So really understanding what the available power is and how we're going to accommodate the masses with that available power is extremely important. And then the third one is an infrastructure plan. So 1 and 2 are important on day 1. Number 3 is something that as you go through the process will become important. And it really speaks to, from the first slide, the layout and design and the infrastructure, ensuring that number 1, the owners in the building can access these panels, and number 2, that you're not going to be left with, a web of piping. So once you understand your limitations, once you have a little bit of an understanding of the design, the power, the availability, and the system that you are potentially putting in, that brings us to slide 3, which is the actual planning and how are we going to move that forward. And number 1 and number 2, again, go together, survey and educate. So early on, a lot of boards were kind of hesitant to send out surveys. 3-4 years ago, they didn't want to rock the boat or bring up the conversation. As we get into 2024, regardless if you think you need this or not, it's coming. More and more people are buying EVs. So understanding what your owners' needs and wants are is extremely important. So who currently has an EV, who's going to buy an EV? And the third question, which is a really important one, is who wants to buy into this? So a lot of owners, across the board, I speak to, different contractors. We're also a contractor, but what we're seeing is that the vast majority of people buying in right now are investors for the future. So if the big issue for you is, okay, I understand that I need this, I understand that there's 1 or 2 people that have an EV, but how do I justify installing this now when, the masses haven't bought in? So really doing surveys and getting people to, which is number 2, educate them to say, look, you're not going to pay for it if you don't use it. It's something that benefits the entire corporation because you have EV infrastructure, and we can find people to buy in, will eventually help you with number 3, which is that final design. And that final design is important because, we've seen, people always say to me, what is the cost to implement EV charging in my building? And I always answer, if properly designed, here are the costs. Because if it's not designed properly, and that can mean a number of things, so I'm going to be vague, if not designed properly, you will run into some major issues. So just to summarize what we've discussed today, or what I've discussed today, number 1, understand your building's limitation. design something around that. A point I want to make is before you get into grants and rebates and what money can we get, it's very important to understand what your building needs and how the solution will help for too often I've seen condos get grants, and I'm not belittling grants, 50% off is great, but 50% off something that doesn't work for you will ultimately only cost you more in the long run. So, regardless of where you are in the process, regardless of where you are as a building and, the EV interest, start the process, go through it, understand your limitation, put together a plan, do a survey, educate, and then ultimately come up with a design that works best for your building. Thank you so much. I'll turn it back over to Brad.
Thank you, Manny. And that was great insight. And I'm just keeping one eye on the Q&A tab here, and there are some amazing questions stacking up where we've already answered something in the presentation. I'm just typing in the quick answer, but for some of the new questions that are coming in, these are unreal, amazing feedback from you folks, and we will do a Q&A at the end. I don't know if we mentioned that, so there will be answers to all these questions. And our next presenter is Anthony, who's going to describe his experience as a board member.
Thanks, Brad. And yeah, I'm really happy to see the attendance now grow to over 275 attendees. So that's amazing. We're happy to be helping out so many property managers and perhaps even board members today. So most of you know me from Condonexus, but I also happen to be a director on my condo board. And in my bit, I'm going to share with you our condo's relatively unique approach to implementing EV charging. So in our condo, just like a lot of other condos, we were hesitant to proceed with a potentially high dollar project, EV charging project, without first understanding the demand for both EV electric vehicles and also EV charging. And the reality at the time, this was back in late 2020, early 2021, was that the then current number of actual EV owners in our condo could literally be counted on one hand. I think there were maybe 3. And our condo is nearly 600 units, actually. In fact, with our sister condo, which shared the same parking lot, over 1,000 units. So if we were rolling out EV infrastructure, so I'm talking about transformers, panels, conduits, wires, Wi-Fi, etc., we didn't want to potentially spot the upfront costs of a major EV project and then really be unsure about how long it might take for unit owners to finally take up and pay for those connections. So what we realized is that at our condo, and I suspect at many other condos as well, we suffered from the chicken and the egg problem. So the chicken and the egg problem is the age-old question: what came first, the chicken or the egg? If there's no egg, can there be a chicken? If there's no chicken, can there be an egg? So how does that apply to EV charging? Well, the analogy, it's a bit of a loose analogy, but when it comes to EV infrastructure, it's like what came first, the EV or the EV infrastructure, or the EV charging? For example, it's sort of like asking, if there are no electric vehicles, when will owners ever want to start paying for EV chargers? And if there are no EV chargers, then, well, when are owners finally going to buy an EV? So we want to get a better sense of demand for EVs and EV charging. So we put out a survey. We did what every what Manny and what Michaela recommended. This is back in 2021 to break the conundrum, the chicken and the egg conundrum. We put out a survey to solicit demand for EV and EV chargers. So in our survey, we do a semi-annual survey, and we plop this question in there to our 600 units or so. Are you planning to purchase an electric vehicle in the next 3 years? This is back in 2021. And 262 individuals responded. And of those 262 individuals, about 29% said, yes, we are looking to buy an EV in the next 3 years. So as we all know, polls are not necessarily the best predictors of the future. You know, if you asked an individual perhaps about past behavior or current behavior, the polls might be fairly reliable. But the moment you start asking about future behavior, polls start to become a bit less reliable. So it was an interesting number, but we wanted more information. So for everyone that said, yes, we are looking to buy an electric vehicle, so for the 75 or so respondents, our survey then sent out a subsequent follow-up question where we stated, okay, look, the price to install a personal EV charging station by a condo unit owner is estimated to be between $6,000 and $10,000. Spoiler alert, it should be closer to $6,000. But these are the numbers that we pulled at the time in 2021 from the internet. So we indicated that this is how much it costs for a personal EV charging station. And owners would still be metered and charged for their individual electrical consumption. So given the cost to install a personal EV charging station, what would be your preferred method for charging your electric vehicle? So the results were very interesting at our condo of about 600 units. We'll start at the bottom. When we asked those 70 or so units who said yes to buying an EV in the next 3 years, the moment we talked about price, they sort of, 6 of them said, you know what, we don't want to buy an EV anymore. So that was interesting. And of the remainder, about 28 or 38% said, you know what, I hear you about the price, but we still want a personal charging station. And then about half of those 70 who said they want to buy an EV in the next few years said, you know what, we're okay with a communal EV charging station in the visitor parking. So obviously the sample is it's not super large, but it does point to trends that there is appetite, or there was appetite for communal EV charging. So for us, in order to break what came first, the EV or the EV charging conundrum, our answer was to install communal EV chargers. And the data itself justified doing so. But then, when we looked into it further, we saw a few other benefits as well. So beyond the data suggesting that there was demand for it, another benefit was, with communal EV chargers, we were able to actually collect data to track actual demand for EV charging. So over time, we could see how much demand there was for EV charging. If we saw demand tick up, or if we sort of hit capacity, that could be a signal for us to proceed with a broader EV infrastructure rollout. Secondly, we believe that by having an option for owners to charge their EVs, we were breaking that chicken and the egg conundrum. So we were able to create EV demand, hopefully, that would precede our broader EV charging infrastructure expansion. Because of course, communal charging, especially if you're in a large condo, is not a long-term solution for EV charging. The other benefit is, we were able to secure, with owners that actually have EVs, then that de-risks things from a financial perspective. At least that's how we saw it. So with owners that have EVs, then the hope is that we'd be able to secure financing before any major EV infrastructure rollout. So a condo and its owners would not be spotting the upfront costs for transformers, etc., and that they could be paid upfront by those who already own EVs and that are willing to pay for it upfront. And the final thing is, it's hard to quantify. We believe it increases the value of the condo, but of course, it's hard to quantify that. But the way I look at it theoretically is, if you compare two identical condos, one happened to have some form of EV charging compared to the other, presumably that condo with EV charging is worth more than the condo without it, and that a potential buyer would be willing to pay more at the condo that has it. So we believe that it increases the value of our condo. So the installation is quick. It was in the factor of months after a board decision, yeah, that was fantastic. That being said, there are considerations if anyone is considering to build EV charging, especially in visitor parking. The first important consideration is, well, are owners allowed to park in visitor parking based on the government governing documents of a condo? Sometimes the declaration says no, visitor parking is reserved for only visitors. That being said, we've heard anecdotes of some condos continuing to proceed with it anyways. Proceed now and apologize later can sometimes be the motto. And that might be all right. It might not be all right. It'll be on a condo by condo basis. But another important consideration, if you do decide to proceed with it, is would any owners be opposed to communal EV chargers in the visitor parking? And if there are very disagreeable owners, sometimes maybe the juice isn't worth the squeeze. So that's something to consider. Do you have enough visitor parking spaces? If there's a scarcity of spaces, that could create issues. As Manny mentioned, installing EV charging can take a long time. It can take a good amount of time, especially if you're applying for grants, like Michaela mentioned. There are certain windows to apply for funding. So to apply for funding and to wait for them to evaluate your application can take time, and then it could take maybe 1 to 2 years to actually implement the EV infrastructure. So if there's a long wait time before the EV infrastructure gets implemented, maybe it's a good idea, something to consider. And the fifth consideration is maybe how many tenants in your condo have EVs. So as we all know, tenants are sort of more at the mercy of their unit owners when it comes to EV charging. Whereas a unit owner has a relatively easier time installing EV charging stations, tenants might not have as many options. So a communal station may be a solution if you happen to have many tenants with EVs. So yeah, as mentioned, we installed communal. We're getting ready now for a broader EV charging rollout at our condo. We're at the very early stages. I'm not going to go through a process because Michaela and Manny have done an amazing job talking about process and planning. But I will quickly, in 2 minutes, talk about one rebate program that we're looking into. This is a federal EV charging infrastructure rebate program in Ontario. To the best of my knowledge, it's currently the only one that most condos are really looking at, and there aren't really any provincial ones. But if anyone does know of any other ones, I'd certainly be happy to hear about it. This federally funded one is called ZVIP, which is the Zero Emission Vehicle Infrastructure Program. And it provides federal funding towards the deployment of EV chargers across Canada. And they fund up to 50% of level 2 EV charging projects, and level 2 EV chargers are probably the ones that are most suitable for condos, up to a maximum of $5,000 per connector. The only caveat is you need maybe not the only caveat, but one caveat is a minimum of 20 level 2 chargers is required. And this funding does cover a variety of eligible costs, so site design, project management, EV chargers, installation costs, permitting, etc. As Michaela mentioned, there are windows. I think even Manny mentioned that there are windows to apply for it. The upcoming stream is it's forecasted to open up in spring of 2024 and close by summer of 2024. That being said, it is a very competitive bidding process. Last year, my understanding is that they had an open application that wasn't supposed to have a deadline and then became quickly super oversubscribed, and then they closed it. So, look out for the upcoming one. And the final point I will say is that, yeah, it is a competitive program. Funding runs out very quickly. That's a typo right there, runs out, it should say. And they do grant funding based on merit. So every application is evaluated based on a variety of factors, and it gives grants to the strongest applications first. And they look at things like the clarity of your project plan and how aligned are you with sustainability goals. One thing I understand is that condos without experience applying for ZVIP are encouraged to engage a consultant or their EV charging solution provider to assist with drafting the application, because it is not a walk in the park. It's a very long application, and there are nuances. So That's my understanding about applying for ZVIT. So with that, I'm going to pass it back to Brad.
All right, thank you very much, Anthony. So your comments about visitor parking have caused quite a stir in the Q&A. So let's go there while we're still talking about it, and then we'll jump into some of our other questions, many of which are excellent. So we have some similar questions here. Lazar asks, question for Bradley, is it legal to allow owners to park and charge in visitor parking, assuming where you've installed a dedicated charging station? So Lazar, it is going to depend on each individual condominium corporation and what your declaration and rules say about visitor parking. And it's also going to depend on how many visitor parking spaces you have, how frequently they are used, and what your enforcement looks like. So every condominium corporation is going to be a little bit different, but in my view, there are certain condominium projects where this will be appropriate, and there are some where, for their own unique reasons, it will not be appropriate. And I'm going to go to one now, which is another question where someone has asked if it's not appropriate. So the answer, Lazar, is there's not one answer for all condos. There are going to be condos that have a lot of visitor parking that have generally relaxed clauses in their declaration and rules, and where enforcement is not a problem, and owners are going to be able to use short-term parking for electric vehicle charging from a communal space. And there are going to be circumstances where that's not going to work. So let's go to one where it's not going to work. And this is, here we go with Nithika. And Nithika asks, if we place a charging station on visitor parking for owners to use, then that visitor parking cannot be used for visitors. True. Does this pose an issue, or do we have to change the declaration? We have 5 spots for 300 units.
Oh,
Yeah, that's an issue. That's a big issue. So normally in the city of Toronto, if you are not located next to a transit line, the zoning bylaw would suggest 0.1 visitor parking spaces per dwelling unit. So a building of your size would typically require 30 visitor parking to satisfy anticipated needs. Now, that number can come down if you have transit really close to your building. And it can also come down if you have other like car sharing or something like that as an alternative in your building. But if you have already maximized all of those things to bring it down to 5 visitor parking for 300 dwelling units, you are unlikely to be taking away 1 or 2 of those 5 spaces to add EV charging and visitor parking. You're just not a good candidate for it. So this is an example of something I was talking about where individual condominium corporations are going to find themselves in very different circumstances when it comes to using visitor parking. Okay, really interesting topic. And let's go to some of the questions from earlier in the seminar. So this was one of the first questions that got posted from Lazar. He asks, is there a prescribed application form? So just so everyone understands what the question is, a prescribed form implies that it's mandatory, that it has to be used and no other application form can be used. So for example, we have a prescribed proxy form. We have a prescribed notice of meeting form. We have a prescribed status certificate. Do we have a prescribed EV application form? No, we do not. We have a template that the Condominium Authority of Ontario has prepared and is available on their website for any unit owner to download and use. The template is acceptable, but in my view, there are better application forms out there that condominium corporations can develop and provide to their owners as part of an information package that will do a better job and will make things easier for everyone involved. So there's no prescribed application form. And then this relates to the same question. The application form should be given by the corporation as a template. Yes, exactly. There should be a template that your condominium corporation has, which is simple, easy to use. Basically, you write in your name, you attach a few documents, you check a few pre-populated boxes, and you sign it over, and it's done. the template that the CAO has. It's a long form, it's complicated. It's not as easy to use as some of the ones that we see condominium corporations developing for their own purposes. Okay. Francisco asks, same question. Is the application by an owner to install an EV charging station a prescribed form? No, it's not. Where is it obtained from? Template from the CAO website. So common question. Okay. More questions here about visitor parking. I'm just sort of curating the questions as we go. Lucio asks, would it be appropriate to install the infrastructure and allow owners to attach to it as they get into the market of owning an electric vehicle, EV vehicle? Okay, so would it be appropriate to install the infrastructure and then allow owners to attach as they as the demand increases? Michaela, do you want to talk about this one?
Yes, absolutely. Yes, again, it depends on the board's vision about the whole process, you know. But if, for example, the board decides to install that, you know, at the corporation cost, or even if they decide to divide the cost by the unit owner and they have only, for example, 2 applications and they install the sub panels or whatever structure is there to allow owners to hook on that later, they could down the road allow more owners to use the same system that was already installed. If that is done by the corporation as a project and they apply for the grants because they need 20 application, it might be that all the spaces are already taken and no more owner could hook on the system. So each corporation is different, again, as we mentioned, and it's based on the electrical capacity and the specific of each corporation, but it is possible. And that's one of the questions that the board and more property managers should ask the contractor and the engineer before embarking on that project.
All right. So a technical question about this seminar from Eric Zhao. Under the continuing professional education report, there are 2 EV activities. One is the EV charging revolution from the 2023 condo conference. The other is EV charging made simple by First Service Residential. Which one are we reporting? Anthony, I think it's neither.
Yeah, it's neither. So you will see in your CMRO manager dashboard this title, Wired for Success, EV Charging in Condos, starting tomorrow. So we will be sending out a certificate of completion by tomorrow as well. And you will see this in your CMRO website tomorrow where you can register for your CPE credit.
Wonderful. Okay, here we go. Question for Manny. What percentage, this is from Ron Schreiber, what percentage of installations are pay upfront versus charging as a service?
It's a great question. So the majority of condos that I personally have engaged with are paying for it up front. Michaela did bring up that there are options for financing, and there's a lot of companies that do that. I personally tell my clients, if you can pay for it, pay for it. Charging as a service or financing is really something that may make it easier for the condo to install today, but as demand grows, you'll just find that you're locked into, you know, contracts that may be very expensive and hard to get out of. So the answer to the question is the majority of jobs that we do, the condos are paying for upfront, and the owners that want a piece of it or have EV charging needs today are financing or paying for their portion.
Thank you, Manny. Okay. A really interesting aspect to this is the impact on townhouse condominium corporations. And so we have a question here from John Peterson, and there was a similar question earlier that I'll try and locate, which is, do you need an EV policy for a townhouse complex? So I'll just recalibrate us. When we talk about the EV regulations under the Condominium Act, we are only talking about installation of charging systems where there is a common element aspect to the installation. So For townhouse condominiums, it's going to depend on the common element / unit boundary. And different townhouses are set up in different ways. And some townhouses are set up in such a way that the charging station can go entirely within the owner's unit. Maybe it's in a garage that forms part of the unit, and it connects to the unit owner's own electricity supply, and there is zero common element impact. In those circumstances, you do not need any of this. And that unit owner does not need the condominium corporation's approval either, unless there happens to be some kind of a rule that would require approval. But in the absence of that kind of a rule, the owner can go ahead and put their charging station within the unit of the townhouse condominium. And but for those condos where the unit boundary is more localized and the parking area is considered common element, or where the unit owner is asking to run cabling through the common elements, that's when we're talking about the EV regulations under the Condo Act. So for townhouse condos, it's going to depend on your site, and some will need a policy and others will not.
So Brett, I see that
Okay.
we're approaching noon, which was the official end time, but I do see that there are so many questions. I believe we're able to extend the meeting for about 15 minutes to answer maybe some additional questions.
Yeah, we've got a lot of questions here. We'll try to get to as many different kinds of questions as we can. And for those who are they've got to run, thank you for joining us for the hour, and you'll get your certificate of completion. For those who want to stay for the Q&A, we'll continue on for 15 more minutes. So Wissam asks, what is the maximum number of EV chargers for each building? I think this could be a Manny question.
Yeah, so that's where a load assessment comes in, and that's where a load assessment is extremely important. So the load assessment will allow you to understand the building's limitation in terms of power and what's available. And from there, the contractor that you work with should help you design a plan on how many EVs you can accommodate with that available power.
All right. Another question for Manny. Barkat Ali asks, how much voltage or power is required to install an EV charging station?
So stations, so just to take a step back, we're typically in condos talking about level 2. So level 1 stations are your household plug, 120 volt, going to take you about 40 hours to charge your vehicle. Level 3 doesn't really work in condos. They're expensive. They need a lot of power, and owners don't want to come home and wait to charge 20 minutes and then move their car. So we're talking about level 2. Level 2 typically ranges between 30 and 80 amps. Sometimes you can go a little bit higher, but we recommend in condos, whatever approach you're taking, letting the owners do their own install or putting communal charging or putting in a system to offer 40 amps per slot. So what we're seeing in the industry is most vehicles in a ecosystem of EV charging are being offered 40 amps, which is 32 amps delivered to the vehicle.
Thank you. Okay, let's go back up to the top here. Anish asks, who would review the drawings, specifications, and location of the proposed installation? And who would incur these costs, the corporation or the owner, for a professional to review and confirm if it is acceptable? So this is in the regulations, Anish, and this is one of the key issues that I identify and why it's good for condominium corporations to have a pre-approved policy, a pre-approved installation agreement, and a pre-approved installation plan for something that you can give to the owner saying, if you install your charging station in this manner, it's approved. And it's something that the condominium corporation has already vetted in advance and is trying to create uniformity in the building so you do not have these one-off installations. And the part of the reason why we recommend that is the issue that you've identified, Anish, which is if you get a one-off application under the regulations, each party is responsible for their own costs unless they agree otherwise. So that would mean the unit owner is responsible for going out and getting a proposal from an installer as to how they're going to connect to your electrical room and run the cabling, and then have a port at their parking space, and then a charging connector. And that's going to cost money from the unit owner side just to put that proposal together. And then the condominium corporation is going to have to hire someone to review it. And that's going to cost the condominium corporation money. And if you're doing this over and over and over again for each individual owner, there's a tremendous inefficiency. So if you don't have a plan, Anish, the problem you're going to encounter is exactly what you've identified, that the condominium corporation is going to be incurring an avoidable cost of having its own qualified professional or an engineer review these plans and sign off on them at the condo's cost. So you don't want that. That's why you do a pre-approved spec. So Thomas Lamb, if owners do not own the parking spots but have right of exclusive use only, so an exclusive use common element parking space, which is more common in some of the older condominium corporations, as opposed to a deeded parking unit, can they request EV installation? Yes. Yes, they can, right? For the purposes of EV installation, it does not matter if it is a exclusive use common element parking space or a deeded parking unit. From my perspective as the lawyer doing the installation agreement, it only means that I'm registering the agreement on title to the owner's dwelling unit as opposed to on title to the parking space itself. But other than that, it should not make any difference at all, Thomas. Okay, Ron Shriver asks, if a condo building installs chargers in the outside parking area, so maybe let's say a visitor or other communal space, are they still required to follow through on an owner's request for a personal inside charger as a matter of law? Michaela, you're nodding. Why don't you take this one?
Yes, absolutely. In my presentation, I pointed out that installation in visitors parking is great, but it should not be instead of installing and replacing installation in the unit owners. If an unit owner requests that, you need to review the application and then find a way to approve it.
I agree. Okay, Katerina asks, if the board wants to install the pay-as-you-go charger only, do we need owner's approval and proceed all the process you mentioned about? So, Katerina, I hope I understand. I think what you're suggesting is a communal charger installed by the condominium corporation at the condominium corporation's cost. That's covered in my first substantive slide right at the start, where I showed a matrix under the old section 97 and under the new EV regulations. And so if the cost of that installation for the condominium corporation is less than 10% of your total common expense budget, then you're going to give a 60-day notice and there's no right of owners to vote. And if the total cost is greater than 10%, you're going to give that 60-day notice, and owners within that 60 days have the right to requisition a simple majority vote of owners. So you're probably giving notice, and there's a very small chance that it could be a vote of owners. Okay, Sunil, can the condo corp make a rule to say that you must charge in the night to avoid the extra load on the capacity or transformer, off-peak usage time, plus the cost of electricity might be less expensive at night? Anthony, do you want some insight on this?
I don't have the insights on this specifically. I do understand that there are some benefits to charging at night now with the new ultra low rates that some condos can apply for, but I wonder if either you, Brad, or Manny might know more about this, or maybe even Michaela. Actually, Michaela, I saw you
Yeah,
unmute.
I think that the rules have to be reasonable to be enforceable, and I don't really know if that would be a reasonable rule restricting owners for the time when they could charge in their own parking spots. So I don't know, Brad.
Yeah, my insight on it is I think you could, as a condominium corporation, you could set your own rates to make it desirable for owners to charge at night. That you could certainly do. And that might be the better option, Sunil, if you're trying to if you're trying to modify behavior, is to say that the condominium corporation will charge electricity at close to cost if you do it overnight. But if you're charging during peak hours, we're going to charge it. First of all, the rate incurred by the condominium corporation that we pass on is higher, and we're going to put a surcharge on it at a higher percentage. And I think if you even give people a slight incentive to charge at night, they will. But then, Manny, you don't want everyone charging at once, right? So why don't you talk to us about that?
Yeah, and that's the point I want to bring up. One of the things that condos can do, and I understand they want people charging at a certain time. 2023, 2024, where you have under 5% of people needing EV charging, it really makes no difference when you force them or not force them to charge. We're really building out these systems when 20, 30, 40, 50% of the building is going to need EV charging. And our recommendation is let people charge when they need it. Because if you're going to try and, cram everyone into a couple of hours, you're going to run out of power and people are going to be unhappy. And to your point, Brad, you can incentivize people by charging different rates. I actually have a condo that we did some work for who's going to flip that and say, we actually don't care when you charge, you're going to be charged the same rate, just to try and get people not to try and set their vehicles for 2 a.m. and 3 a.m. and then you have this bottleneck. Charge when you need to charge, the building will have available power. And the other point is, through software, whichever provider you end up using, can actually set parameters within the system. So if you only want to have a certain amount of power available during the day, which is more limited, through software we can set that and there'll be less power available to the vehicles. And then in the evening we can open up the power as needed. So limiting people to when they charge, in my opinion, is probably not the greatest idea.
Thank you so much. Okay, a few people have asked, do we have a sample EV installation agreement that I can share? I have a template, and if people want to email me at bchaplick@LDTC Lawyers, I'm happy to talk to you about what that template should look like and show you what it has to include. Each condominium corporation is going to use a slightly different installation agreement because you have different condominium corporations, and there is a lot of different stuff that happens in individual condominiums in terms of how they are created, whether you have common element, exclusive use parking, whether you have parking units, and how those things relate to each other. So there are a few different versions of this agreement. It's not a one size fits all for every condominium, but yes, I'm happy to talk to you about how to design a good installation agreement and getting that to people so that it can be a simple fill in the blank, so that you're not getting a new agreement every time. You have a template for your corporation that's been created for you. Owners fill it out, they write their name at the top, they sign it at the bottom, and you're good to go, and it gets registered on title. Okay, a few questions about that. Let's just go through those. All right. Ada asks, if a particular condo corporation is not interested in installing EV charging for everyone, can one individual unit owner install for only their own benefit at their expense and connected to their hydro meter? Anyone want to jump in on this one? This is what if we are not into it, it's of no interest to us, and we just have the one unit owner who wants to do their own thing. How do we deal with that situation?
Yeah, so I can take that one. If condos aren't ready or aren't interested, and there's an owner that wants EV charging, it's definitely doable. What's going to happen is you're probably not going to be able to connect it to the owner's meter. A lot of times their meter is, in the tower up in the building, but we can find a spare breaker within one of the existing panels of the condo, put in a dedicated breaker, run pipe and wire to their parking spot. All the costs in terms of engineering and electrical and any upgrades will be paid for, have to be paid for by that owner. And then there are multiple ways to have that meter, which the easiest one is just having the metering company from the building, either Toronto Hydro or whoever the utility is or the sub metering, just add a CT on that breaker, and then they can add the consumption to the condo owner's existing bill. So it's very doable. It's something that we recommend not be done often. In other words, you can do 1 or 2 of these to kick the can down the road. But if you have 5, 6, 7, 8, 10, as we've all discussed in our presentations, limited power and tracking and billing, and as more people want it, will become a major issue for the corporation.
All right. GOT asks, we had applied for a grant under ZVIP for 40 chargers, but our grant was not approved. Is the grant more for older buildings rather than newer ones? GOT manages a relatively new condominium corporation. Anthony, any insight as to why grants get approved and some do and some don't? It might be timing.
Yeah, one thing is timing. You want to apply as early as possible. They do get very oversubscribed, and sometimes they close off the window early. But on top of that, it is very merit-based. And my understanding is they do look at how clear are you on your project plan. Things are like, what do you need? How long is it going to take? How much is it going to cost? Do you have an understanding of what permits you need? Things like that, as well as how aligned are you with sustainability goals of the federal government, because we are part of the Paris Agreement, and in one way or indirectly at least, this whole ZVIP program is related to creating EV infrastructure which expands sustainability goals. So there are a lot of things that go into it. It is very merit based. So we always I've been told that it's recommended that you reach out to a consultant or your EV installer to help apply for that. But I don't believe it's necessarily more for older buildings than newer ones. I don't know. We're approaching 12:15. Manny, I don't know if you have any insights on that.
Yeah, very quickly on that. So there really is, there's the general understanding of what makes an application better than others. I think it really just comes down to all these grants, especially today, as we get deeper into the EV, they're overprescribed. They're getting a ton of applications. So, as you said, Anthony, is the quicker the better. And if you're not approved, it's probably not something you did wrong. It's just there's limited funding and a lot of applications.
All right, let's do our last question if we can. And it's the one thing we haven't talked about yet, reserve funds. So I'm sorry to end on a real doozy here, but this is a controversial topic. It's been asked a couple times here. This will be our last question, even though we've got a few that unfortunately we couldn't get to just because of time. Stephen and a few others have asked, can you use the reserve fund for infrastructure costs for EV charging? And Stephen suggests that maybe since 2020, this has been allowed. Stephen, I hate to burst your bubble. I don't believe there was any change in 2020 to the proper use of condominium corporation reserve funds. There are some changes to the Condominium Act that are not yet implemented. I don't think that those are going to help either. Most condominium corporations would not be able to properly use a reserve fund to install a new service for owners. This is exactly why the EV regulations are written the way they are. They specifically contemplate that this is something that would require notice to owners, or in some cases, unit owner approval, which is inconsistent with using a reserve fund, and that it's not a major repair or replacement. Now, there are rare circumstances where the nature of your EV project is that you are going to be replacing existing electrical infrastructure in the building. And in those circumstances where you are replacing existing electrical infrastructure, you could apply that portion of the cost from the Condominium Corporation's reserve fund. But other than that, sort of limited and rare example, this is not going to be a reserve fund expense. You're going to find that it's going to come from operating a surplus, or it's going to come from other financing sources, or from the unit owners who are requesting the installation in their parking spaces. Anyone else want to chime in on this before we wrap up for this afternoon? Anthony's saying nope. Okay. All right, Anthony, you want to take us out?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I want to thank the 270 plus individuals that joined today's meeting. Again, we've heard the questions about EV charging sprout out so much more frequently in our hosted virtual AGMs nowadays, that we want to host this webinar just to provide property managers with expert perspectives on EV charging. The whole space is changing technology-wise, regulation-wise, and even business models for EV charging stations. So we want to make sure our property managers had the most up-to-date information. I want to thank everyone for their questions. Everyone's going to get an email shortly just confirming their attendance, and we will send out a certificate for completion tomorrow. And my understanding is this webinar will be available on the CMROA website for registering for your CPE credit by tomorrow, but some are saying that it's already there. So definitely have a look out and look out for a follow-up email from us with our video and our presentation. I want to thank Brad from Levitt, Lella, Duggan, and Chaplick for chairing the meeting. I want to thank Michaela for providing her amazing manager perspective on EV charging in condos. Her experience is invaluable. And I want to thank Manny for providing his great insights on the technical considerations when it comes to implementing EV charging. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, all attendees, for joining. I'm going to say goodbye for now.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye, guys.
Thanks, Anthony.
Thanks so much.